Welcome to the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson, and this podcast series is a conversation with Matt, the Bearded Naked Yogi. In this 10-episode series, we're delving deep into the core principles of yoga, shedding light on its ancient wisdom and timeless teachings. Matt is taking us through the 8 limbs of yoga, sharing his philosophy and revealing the essence of this ancient practice. Matt, this is episode 9 of the series. What are we covering this time around?
So yes, here we are, episode 9. And we are going to discuss today the 8th and final limb of yoga, which is known as Samadhi. And Samadhi is, again, another one of those very beautiful words within the Sanskrit language. And within the yogic tradition, Samadhi is seen as the culmination of the previous 7 limbs. It's not a practice within itself per se, but it is rather a state of being. And that state of being is an experience of complete oneness. It is an experience of the yogi as a unified whole. And I'll pick up again, just as we did in the previous episode. When we arrive within the final limbs of yoga, let's not get too caught up in the language around all of this. Many people across millennia have tried to codify this experience, and certainly Samadhi can be seen as that elusive goal of enlightenment, awakening, as they call it, within the Zen tradition, or perhaps even grace within Western Christian mysticism. Listen to the words with an open heart and with a sense that there is something far bigger than ourselves as individuals. And perhaps that thing that is far bigger than ourselves is that ultimate state of union and wholeness. And again, let's just take a moment to reflect on the meaning of the word yoga. Yoga is union, and that wholeness is the state of yoga.
So this is the culmination of the work that we've done before, the limbs that we've been exploring, the money shot, I guess you could call it in that sense.
A spiritual money shot.
Yeah, that's the way I'm thinking of it, definitely.
I'm stealing that. I'm stealing that. I'm totally stealing that.
But it's a big concept, isn't it? That, you know, union, that wholeness, that oneness. And I guess, what does that mean in a practical sense? Oneness with what?
Have you ever sat there? Have you ever found yourself in an experience and perhaps watching a sunset or seeing a particularly beautiful sky or an amazing vista, and you've arrived there and all of a sudden you find yourself without words and your mind goes completely blank? Have you ever had an experience like that?
I did see Beyonce in concert once, and that was pretty similar, I think.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing. But, you know, let's have standards, you know. Celine is far better. But that's an experience. That's an aspect of Samadhi. You're in a place, you're in a moment. Everything has dropped away. And within that moment, there's simply a thisness to it. There's no past, there's no future. There's only exactly where you are within that moment. However fleeting, however brief it is. That is an experience of Samadhi. The mind is blank. There are no words of language to express that experience. And I think it's interesting to note within many of the yogic texts that there are different layers, perhaps. There are different levels, if you like, of Samadhi. There is that brief, fleeting moment that we experience this oneness, this connection. And I like that metaphor of being in a concert. It's you're all together. You're all having an experience. Everyone is in that moment, enjoying it for exactly what it is. You know, and having been to concerts myself, you know, you think, oh wow, 2 hours is a long time to be there. 2 hours goes by like that. Time doesn't really exist.
Time doesn't exist at a Beyonce concert, exactly.
I won't say. I do admire her as a singer. That's the thing, but I'll say nothing else because it's controversial. I'm a terrible gay man.
Yeah, this is not the podcast we're debating Beyonce. Let's move on.
So when we're talking about that practical sense of this, a sense of oneness, what does it all mean? You know, many people throughout time have attempted to define this to human language and explain it to other people, what Samadhi means and how that experience of being in the state of Samadhi feels. But it is here absolutely that our human languages fail utterly in their attempts to explain or express this concept. To an individual that has entered into a state of Samadhi, there is nothing to explain, and there are no words needed to express themselves or their experience. They have become themselves completely. There is no more internal, there is no more external division within the experience of themselves, within the cosmos itself. There is no division within the relationship with the world, with other people. Perhaps in a very beautiful way, we can say that they have seen the face of God and they have found that face to be their own. There is no this, there is no that. There simply is.
You touched on this briefly, but I'd just be interested in hearing a bit more about it, sort of levels of Samadhi. So how does that work in that sort of sense of oneness and connection and union? How would you describe those different levels?
Those different levels, we can look at those brief flashes of oneness and wholeness that an individual may have through the practice of yoga. And those brief moments, they come, but then before we know it, our thoughts have returned, our tasks and our obligations have returned. We've sat there and experienced a sense of wholeness and oneness by looking at a beautiful seascape. But then all of a sudden, life itself comes back in and you're back where you were. You're off wondering and worrying and comparing and analysing. And those different levels of Samadhi, again, through consistent practice of the limbs of yoga, there is then another level of Samadhi where one has this realization, one has this experience of oneness and being of a unified whole. But there's still a little sense of division, perhaps. Separation, perhaps, is a more correct word. And that sense of separation is that one is aware of being within a state of Samadhi. So again, you've got the yogi and you've got the state of Samadhi. Within the two of them, there is a recognition of each other. So that creates a sense of duality, however slight that may be. Within what's known as the highest level of Samadhi, there is no separation. There is absolutely nothing. Everyone you look at, you see yourself reflected back. You look out into the world, you see yourself reflected back. And in fact, the highest experience of Samadhi as written in the text, even reflection becomes a very poor word because there's certainly no mirror. You realize you are the mirror. It's all you. It's absolutely you. And maybe you, in inverted commas, actually don't exist at all.
Deep. We talked about Samadhi being the culmination of the eight limbs, and I just think it might be worth just reminding us all how the limbs sort of build on each other and connect, and how we end up at sort of this aspirational top of the tree with Samadhi.
So with all of this, what the limbs of yoga have done very well and continue to do for millions of people across the world is providing that guide and that framework of key practices for the individual to explore themselves, to explore what this all means, to begin to answer some of those questions that they may have about themselves. the physical practices of yoga, the breathing exercises of yoga, those ethical considerations that one would examine. And again, once more, certainly within the second half of the 8 limbs of yoga, those ever deepening, contemplative, meditative practices. I think what's very interesting about all of this, and if we think of the actual book of the Yoga Sutras itself, that essential meaning behind all of this really can be summed up within the first 3 lines of the Yoga Sutras. And I'm often one for saying that you can read the Yoga Sutras from start to finish, but the most important 3 lines within that book are the first 3 verses. The first line of the Yoga Sutras says, "The practice of yoga starts now," or "now begins the practice of yoga." It didn't start in the past and it will not start in the future. It begins right now. There is an immediacy to this. There is a nowness to this. There is a focus upon this moment for beginning that journey, for experiencing that journey. The second verse of the sutras simply says, "Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind." It describes to you what the practice of yoga is. All of those 8 limbs are summed up in that second line. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Those fluctuations refer to the different behaviors of the mind and our emotions and perceptions. The third line of the sutras, it provides us with the outcome of all of this. If I do my yamas, my niyamas, my asana practice, my pranayama, my pratyahara, I've established in dharana, I'm meditating my ass off in the limb of dhyana. What happens? And the third verse says, the yogi becomes established within their true nature. And that's it. It is an examination, a building upon, and an exploration of one's true nature.
It's fascinating, but it does all sound a bit daunting. But I'm assuming that the answer to "Am I ready?" is yoga starts now. So it's a now or never sort of question. But yeah. Matt, this is the final limb of yoga that we're going to be covering in this podcast series. But we've got one more episode to go. What are we going to be covering in the next episode?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in episode 10 of this series, we are going to be exploring some of the practicalities, perhaps, about what all of this means. We've had some wonderful discussions here and have shared many, many examples of the experiences along the path of yoga, the journey of yoga. And in episode 10, we are going to be hopefully bringing this into a more modern sense of understanding, seeing how we can apply these practices and principles to our lives, and really exploring around that theme that underpins the whole of yoga, about becoming who you are. And certainly I'll be sharing maybe some humorous anecdotes and teachings and the philosophy behind the bearded naked yogi teaching practice.
That brings us to the end of episode 9 of the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at GTV London. If you want to get in touch with Matt or find out more about his online courses and retreats, head over to his website, thebeardednakedyogi.com.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode, episode 10 of this series. Take very good care of yourselves, and thank you very, very much.